Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Stanier, and I am with the Fraser Basin Council. Thanks for joining us today, taking your lunch hour out of your very busy days at a very busy time of the year to join us for a presentation on a hydrogen project that we've been working on with support from Dunsky Energy and also from, or with support from the province. So just a little bit about us. Fraser Basin Council is a charitable nonprofit organization that brings people together to advance sustainability in BC. I see a lot of familiar names in our guest list. You are probably familiar with working with me and our staff through various electric vehicle programs in BC. Today, we are talking about this hydrogen project, which Ali from Dunsky is going to walk us through. Before we get going, I just want to mention that I'm joining this call today from the unceded traditional territory of the Comox Nation. And again, I just want to thank you for joining us from wherever you are throughout the province or anywhere that you are in the world right now. I know people are working remotely from all over. So I'm going to pass it over to Ali very shortly. Ali is going to do her presentation about the study. And that should take us to just before 1 o'clock. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us. And Ali, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, let's get underway.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. This webinar is about exploring the feasibility of hydrogen in remote communities. Just before we get started, a little bit about Dunsky, for those of you who don't know much about us. We're sort of a mix between an engineering and management consulting firm with a focus on analysis and strategy, and we focus mainly in 4 key areas: buildings, mobility, industry, and energy. We've just hit our 20-year mark, and we have about 60 employees across the country. We mainly work with governments, utilities, and nonprofits, and these are just a few examples of some of the organizations and companies and governments that we've worked with throughout the years. A quick overview of what we're going to go through on this project. First, we'll talk a little bit about the context for the project. We will give a little bit of a hydrogen primer for those that are a little less familiar with hydrogen. We'll talk about evaluating hydrogen feasibility as it relates to remote communities. And then we'll discuss some of the key findings from our illustrative case studies in the work that we just completed. And then just a brief what's next, what to do moving forward. So starting with the project context, remote communities are off-grid settlements that are not connected to the North American electrical grid or piped natural gas network. Just one caveat there, that there are a subset of remote communities unique to BC called end-of-line communities that are connected to the transmission grid, however, do have diesel backups as they experience frequent outages. Remote communities continue to rely on diesel generators for their power and heating needs as a backup source for their electricity. Diesel serves as a reliable, scalable energy source that is easily stored and transported. However, diesel, that many of us know of, had negative social, economic, and environmental ramifications. So it comes with air and noise pollution that can disrupt ecosystems, impair quality of life. Also, often there are accidental diesel spills and leaks during transport, storage, and handling that can contaminate soil and ground or surface water. The release of carbon dioxide is a significant contributor to climate change. And diesel prices are expensive and volatile, requiring significant subsidization to maintain affordability. And in some communities, subsidies reduce the cost of diesel by 10 to 30 times. Also, a loss of power in remote communities when projects fail in these settings often mean that communities lose access to electricity, and consequences can become life-threatening, as many of these communities are isolated in remote environments and experience harsh weather conditions. So naturally, the province of BC has set forth a target to reduce diesel consumption in remote communities by over 80% relative to 2019 by the year 2030. So renewables in remote communities, excuse me, generating electricity from renewable sources, it has been a key decarbonization pathway in remote communities historically and currently. However, in recent years, hydrogen has emerged as a tool that could contribute to the decarbonization of our global energy systems. Hydrogen is a fuel that can be reliable, scalable, and storable, which makes it attractive to complement the intermittency of renewable energy sources, as well as having potential in some of the harder to electrify sectors such as industry. However, to date, there's been limited exploration of hydrogen in remote communities specifically. So today, for our scope of work, we'll be covering that this project focused on assessing the potential for hydrogen to serve as that in the role of that complementary solution to help transition remote communities away from diesel and contribute to more cost-effective emissions reductions. The goal of our body of work was to summarize the diverse hydrogen production pathways, storage, and transport methods, as well as potential end uses within remote communities. Identify a subset of enabling conditions that are required for establishing hydrogen ecosystem in remote communities, as well as gauging the interest of some remote communities in establishing hydrogen systems, and lastly, examining the potential contribution and cost effectiveness of hydrogen in remote communities through 2 illustrative case studies. So next we'll move on to just a brief hydrogen primer for those that are maybe a little less familiar with hydrogen fuel. So there are several opportunities and challenges associated with hydrogen and its potential role in decarbonizing rural communities. In terms of the opportunities and why we wanted to explore hydrogen is scalable. Electrolytic production of hydrogen is a scalable, clean process requiring only water and clean electricity. As renewable energy sources become cheaper and more accessible, the scalability of hydrogen produced from renewable electricity increases. That means hydrogen production can be adjusted to match the fluctuations in energy demand and making it adaptable to different community sizes and needs. Hydrogen is also versatile. It's a clean fuel that offers optionality in its applications, making it potentially suitable for heating, power, and transportation. Hydrogen is also reliable. Similar to diesel, hydrogen is a physical fuel that can be stored in large quantities as a backup, making it a reliable option for remote communities, particularly those who face unstable power grids and energy supply challenges. However, there are a number of challenges that are associated with hydrogen. First and foremost, it's nascent. Hydrogen energy systems lack the maturity and widespread adoption as seen in more established technologies such as wind and solar. Hydrogen is expensive. The production, storage, and distribution of hydrogen, particularly electrolytic hydrogen, is more expensive than conventional energy sources and some renewable alternatives. Achieving cost parity with these sources will be critical for hydrogen to become a viable option in its widespread adoption. And lastly, infrastructure. Developing the necessary infrastructure requires substantial upfront investment and coordination, including electrolysis facilities, safe storage solutions, and a reliable distribution network. In terms of the components of a hydrogen-based system, a hydrogen-based energy system commonly consists of 3 basic components. Hydrogen production involves the generation of hydrogen gas through methods such as electrolysis, steam methane reforming, or thermochemical processes, and those could be done on-site or off-site. Hydrogen storage involves methods of high-pressure gas storage in tanks or geological storage such as caverns, aquifers, or depleted oil wells. The distribution of hydrogen, if it's produced off-site, involves the transportation to and from the production site to the end user via pipelines, trucks, or trailers. And for utilization, it just refers to the various applications of hydrogen as a fuel for energy uses within the community. So transportation, building heat and hot water heating, and electricity generation. Of note, there are other ways that hydrogen can be distributed, for example, via marine vessels or pipelines. It also has use cases in industrial applications, but those were left out of this study as they're not particularly applicable to remote communities. So first and foremost, there are two categories to hydrogen production. The first one is on-site in the context of remote communities. This refers to hydrogen produced via electrolysis, co-located with renewables. This method is highly suitable to remote communities, especially those with access to abundant renewables and limited accessibility. And by that, I mean limited accessibility with road infrastructure to and from the communities. The decision on which source to use really depends on various factors, such as the availability of renewable energy and grid connectivity or other local conditions. There are a few positives to local on-site production. There's flexibility, again, be able to respond to demand fluctuations. There is a greater energy security as you're producing the energy locally versus transporting it in from outside of the community. And so you're not as susceptible to supply chain disruptions. Assuming that it is produced from renewables, there's low to no emissions. Again, scalability is limited. That's one of the challenges with on-site production. So if you have an existing wind project, for example, the scalability of hydrogen produced from that project is limited to the size and availability of wind generation of that project. It's also resource intensive. Electrolysis requires high water, land, and electricity requirements. Additionally, there are high upfront costs, especially if there is no existing renewable production within the community. There's a need for investment in electrolyzers, fuel cells, tanks, and other renewable components, again, if those don't exist on site. For off-site production, this could be through various pathways from fossil fuels with carbon capture or off-site electrolysis. The environmental impact of off-site production really depends on the source of hydrogen, which can be produced from any one of these pathways. And so it's not a guarantee that you will achieve emissions reductions with off-site production depending on the pathway. You're also, again, vulnerable to supply chain disruptions due to transporting hydrogen from outside of the community. And so any sort of implications to road infrastructure or reductions in production at the source facility can result in supply chain disruptions to the local community. However, there is a degree of greater scalability because if you're bringing it in from offsite, you're an off-taker from a much larger facility, more likely, and so your demand you can be easily adjusted based on demand. As well, there's an element of lower upfront cost as you're only really requiring the storage tanks and the fuel cells to convert the hydrogen and gas to electricity, and you don't need to build out large renewable infrastructure or the cost of electrolyzers. There are two types of storage, and storage type feasibility heavily depends on the local geological conditions. So large-scale geological storage may not even be available within the community, in which case the only option would be modular storage, which would be high-pressure hydrogen gas stored in tanks or cylinders. This method is widely used because of its simplicity and its maturity of technology. There is a lower upfront cost with this, as the cost to explore geologic storage and also permitting and whatnot is significantly higher. However, hydrogen tanks are quite expensive. So if demand increases significantly, where the number of tanks increases significantly, then you might experience higher long-term costs. For large-scale storage, that can be offered by the availability of geologic storage. So if there are nearby salt caverns, hard rock caverns, or aquifers, this is generally considered safe and economical for massive volumes of gaseous hydrogen. Again, if there is no geologic storage available on or near the community, then this is null. But this is associated with also complex regulatory and permitting processes and a really high upfront investment to develop that geological storage and make sure that it is safe and suitable. However, again, once you reach massive volumes of hydrogen, you can get higher economies of scale. There are three key end uses for hydrogen: heating, transportation, and power. Heating using hydrogen boilers uses hydrogen gas as a fuel to produce heat for space and hot water applications, very similar to natural gas boilers. There are, however, many challenges with using hydrogen for heating. Firstly, you need a dedicated distribution network to distribute the gas to the boilers. Additionally, existing in-home piping is not suitable for hydrogen as it will leak and rust. And so there are high costs, not only with building out a distribution network, but the cost of retrofitting homes and developing the proper infrastructure that is compatible with hydrogen gas. While hydrogen boilers offer a low carbon alternative to natural gas boilers, the overall efficiency of hydrogen boilers is lower due to energy loss during production, transportation, and conversion into heat, making heat pumps the most viable option for the communities, which they're more efficient, more cost-effective, and more mature. For this reason, we actually believe that there is no real role for hydrogen in heating in domestic applications, and this is supported by various studies by other authors that examine the role of hydrogen in domestic applications. Hydrogen can also be used as a fuel for light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles in the form of fuel cell vehicles. Battery electric vehicles are currently viewed as the primary pathway to light and medium-duty vehicle decarbonization. However, in very small communities, like remote communities with limited grid, unmanaged EV charging can result in peak load growth and the need for large investments in additional grid infrastructure, which is unsustainable. And so fuel cell vehicles potentially could play a role by mitigating some of that unmanaged peak load and complementing the use of electric vehicles. However, the costs of fuel cell vehicles are significantly higher due to the very high costs associated with vehicle production, fuel cell technology, hydrogen production, and distribution. Fuel cell vehicles also require dedicated refueling infrastructure, similar to traditional gas stations. However, traditional gas stations are not compatible. For power generation, which is the third opportunity for end use, hydrogen can be used by fuel cells as a clean and efficient way to generate electricity, which makes them more ideal for various applications, including powering remote communities. There are hydrogen gas turbines. However, they're very large, less scalable, and currently limited to about 10% hydrogen to 90% natural gas. And while they are projected to have that ratio be higher, they are not proven for that yet, and so they're not technologically mature. So as it relates to fuel cells, you can increase the resiliency of power generation on site because you can store hydrogen and produce electricity locally. Fuel cells are mature and have a high technological readiness. However, you might need, again, to build out additional infrastructure in terms of storage tanks and other networks. And there is the upfront cost of fuel cells and if it's locally produced, electrolyzers and storage tanks. Now we will move on to evaluating hydrogen feasibility. So we've developed a 3-step framework for assessing the feasibility of hydrogen within these communities. The first one is to assess the enabling conditions of the community. The second step is to define the hydrogen system. So once you have a better understanding of the characteristics that exist within a specific remote community, you can then look at the different hydrogen pathways and define what are the potential pathways for building out hydrogen and implementing it within the community. And the third step would be to conduct an actual quantitative analysis using community-specific data, consumption values, and load characteristics to then get the achievable potential for that specific community. This would offer insights into the technical, financial feasibility of specific hydrogen pathways and validate or disprove your theoretical role of hydrogen that you came up with after step 1 and step 2. So moving on to some of the enabling conditions, remote communities are characterized by a set of enabling conditions, and these conditions influence the community level ability to support the development and integration of all new energy systems. So the first one being accessibility and road access. So the lack of adequate year-round road access can create challenges in implementing hydrogen systems. It can delay the deployment of personnel, making it harder to overcome certain operational challenges if there is no employees within the community who are capable. BC remote communities are located in different climate zones throughout the entire province, ranging from mild to Arctic. And infrastructure within these communities must be built to withstand the challenges of each climate zone, especially those in remote or harsh climates. And for example, fuel cells and electrolyzers run at high temperatures. And so additional infrastructure may be needed to house those in colder climates to ensure that they are running at optimal operating temperatures. In terms of infrastructure and consumption, communities may rely entirely on diesel or a mix of diesel and, or in the case of end-of-line communities, some transmission. And so hydrogen's scalability and decarbonization potential hinges on the emissions reduction potential and level of diesel dependency within these communities. As I alluded to earlier, the ability to generate electricity on site is fundamental for producing hydrogen locally. And so limited freshwater resources can restrict the selection and viability of electrolyzer technologies, making things like freshwater access a pivotal factor in the deployment of hydrogen production systems. Additionally, renewable resources such as wind and solar for the viability of developing local renewable energy systems. Remote communities in BC have a variety of different service providers. Some of their grids are managed by BC Hydro, and some of them are independently owned and operated. And the type of service provider, particularly in the context of independent power providers and utilities, affects the distribution of responsibilities for safety, reliability, and operational management of these energy systems. And so the viability of hydrogen really depends on who's owning and operating these systems and their capacity and willingness to operate and maintain these systems. The initial investment required for hydrogen infrastructure may be high, and small communities often struggle to achieve economies of scale. And remote communities, some of them are a fair bit larger, and some of them actually have less than 100 people. And so human capital and access to funding may be limited in smaller communities. Sometimes there might be opportunities for collaborative ventures between neighboring communities that can help these small communities together achieve a large economy of scale. There are also some isolated microgrids that serve multiple communities in the case of some of BC Hydro's non-integrated areas that can help generate economies of scale for smaller remote communities. The next step, again, would be to define the hydrogen ecosystem. So once you have a better understanding of the conditions which exist within the remote community that you're exploring the potential for hydrogen for, you examine those enabling conditions, and then you evaluate the various production, storage, and distribution pathways and their ability to meet that community's specific needs and use cases. Once you've identified the different pathways, you would then begin to identify the specific technologies and components that are required to support the specific hydrogen pathways. And lastly, from there, you would do a quantitative analysis to model the communities and compare the results of the quantitative analysis to the community-specific goals and priorities. So you would consider the relevant technical, economic, geographical, and social metrics. You would then take all of these things into consideration with community-specific data and simulate the most viable system. By that could mean the most cost-effective, highest emissions reductions, other community priorities for various combinations of different technologies, and determine which system configuration, if any, and components needed meet those community needs. In terms of the key findings for some of our illustrative case studies, so first, just to set the stage, what we did here is we did two illustrative case studies, techno-economic assessments, to assess the feasibility of hydrogen. One, for 100% diesel-dependent remote community, the role of hydrogen in this community was for renewable balancing, where a renewable energy system was developed as the primary source of power within the community. And when renewable generation exceeded community demand, the excess electricity would be utilized to produce hydrogen that is stored in tanks on site and later utilized either to meet peak demand or when renewable generation was lower than demand. The second case study was for a grid-connected end-of-line community that has an average of 5 days of outage per month. We assume that their normal baseline for these outages is to use 100% of the load from diesel generators. In this case study, hydrogen is modeled strictly as a backup resource to meet the needs of the community during the outage events. And during normal grid operations, excess electricity from the grid is used to produce and store hydrogen locally to replenish the hydrogen supply between outage events. The case studies in these communities broadly reflect conditions and characteristics observed in various remote communities within BC, however, are not specific to any one community. For these case studies, we used Homer modeling software to simulate different energy sources, including renewables, grid power, and storage, to explore various energy system configurations with the goal of identifying the most cost-effective pathways to achieving emissions reductions within each case study. And just one thing to note, as I may have alluded to earlier, the case studies in this report focus on modeling exclusively power generation applications, and we exclude the use of hydrogen for transportation and heating. It is unlikely for hydrogen to play a major role in decarbonizing transportation based on some of the communities that we've talked to. Road infrastructure is limited. Community members often use ATVs to travel within the community. And when traveling beyond the community, they often travel by air to access amenities outside of the community. And then hydrogen for heating, due to low efficiency, extremely high costs, is really not cost competitive with alternative technologies. And that assumption, we assume that there's really no role for hydrogen in domestic heating, which is supported by other studies in literature. So for the first case study, modeling a 100% diesel-dependent community, renewable energy plus battery storage offers the most cost-effective pathway to achieving that 80% decarbonization goal in power applications. Achieving this target from renewables has a lower cost than the baseline diesel system, primarily due to the substantial reduction in diesel fuel costs. When we consider hydrogen plus a renewable scenario, it could potentially represent an alternative cost-competitive solution to meeting the same target. However, hydrogen's feasibility and applicability largely relies on government subsidies and alignment with community priorities. And when I refer to subsidies, we assume that in both case studies, a 40% discount is applied to the cost of hydrogen technology, and this is associated with the federal Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit. Of note, for the renewables plus hydrogen scenario, hydrogen only contributes to about 5% of the community's electricity needs, and indicating that it only becomes cost effective when renewable generation cannot meet peak demand. And so really the decision between these two options in achieving that 80% decarbonization target solely with renewables or renewables plus hydrogen, it should be determined by community-specific goals and considerations, assuming these conditions are correct. There is also a need, this is for a sufficient renewable resource, for example, some combination of wind, solar, or hydro. In the same context of this 100% diesel-dependent remote community, we also considered a 100% emissions reduction scenario beyond the provincial goal of achieving 80%. Achieving 100% emissions reduction solely with renewables and energy storage actually requires significant overbuild of wind, solar, and batteries just to satisfy those peak demand requirements and maintain system reliability without diesel. As compared to the 80% reduction scenario, this exact same community needs double the wind and solar capacity and 5 times the storage capacity to achieve system-wide reliability. This leads to considerable capital expenditure and levelized costs that are greater than the existing diesel generating system. Alternatively, if you look at the inclusion of renewables and hydrogen, hydrogen reduces the need for overbuilding renewable capacity, providing a more balanced and economically feasible approach to full decarbonization while also still maintaining reliability. However, it's worth noting that hydrogen production is not actually increased significantly within this scenario as compared to the 80% scenario, still meeting only 5%, approximately 5% of the annual electricity consumption. And again, this really speaks to the point of where hydrogen is really most cost effective when renewables need to be significantly oversized to meet peak demand. And so hydrogen supplements that by meeting peak demand. In this case study, the biggest change for hydrogen is that the size of the fuel cell was doubled to meet the peak demands without needing any additional diesel. Again, to reiterate, the cost effectiveness of these two scenarios is dependent on those government subsidies as well as community priorities that would always need to be taken into consideration. For the second case study, we modeled that end-of-line community with monthly outage events, which are 5 days in length. Looking at solely a renewables plus energy storage only system sized to meet that unmet load during outages, it requires a significant overbuild of resources to meet peak demand. This requires a significant upfront capital investment and results in an extremely high levelized cost of energy. Alternatively, meeting the entire outage load of the community using hydrogen generated from excess grid electricity or hydrogen produced offsite, then transported and stored locally, both cost more than the baseline, but are significantly less than the renewable only scenario. From an economic perspective, both hydrogen options represent cost increases, however, from the baseline. However, from a decarbonization lens, hydrogen represents a potentially viable opportunity to achieve 100% emissions reductions when you compare it to a renewables plus storage only scenario. When comparing the two hydrogen scenarios, the main economic advantage of local production stems from avoiding the cost of transporting hydrogen to the community from an offsite facility, which really accounts for about 1/3 of the costs in that scenario. Ultimately, decarbonizing the backup diesel systems in these communities represents a cost increase as they must be sized to meet the full load for a multi-day outage, but really they only represent less than 20% of the annual community consumption, where the remaining 80-ish% is met by normal grid operations. And just a note, for these scenarios, we assume that the hydrogen generated offsite is produced from clean electricity and transported using non-emitting vehicles, and that would achieve near 100% emissions reductions. However, that would need to be proven in a community-specific study. And so the total emissions reductions may vary in future studies. So looking ahead, what does this mean going forward? The long-term viability of using hydrogen in remote community decarbonization remains uncertain. In our body of work, its economic feasibility hinges on the hydrogen investment tax credit, which we assume projects will be eligible for the highest tier, covering 40% of hydrogen technology costs. However, that's not necessarily verified and needs to, again, be verified through a community-specific assessment. The success of these projects will depend also on overcoming other barriers, including financial, technical, and logistical challenges, as well as aligning with community priorities. Some communities may not be interested in hydrogen, and so that might prevent a project from moving forward. Additionally, each remote community is unique, and therefore decarbonization requires a bespoke approach and should be precisely tailored to meet the specific needs of each community. And so while these two case studies demonstrate the potential role that hydrogen could play in these two types of communities. Again, they're not entirely applicable to specific remote communities, and so these results need to be validated with community-specific data. So communities interested in exploring hydrogen should first and foremost evaluate local interest within the community, raise awareness, conduct engagements, and build support and capacity within the community to potentially explore, own and or operate hydrogen projects within the community. Second, they should consider conducting or following the three-step framework that we've laid out. First and foremost, evaluating the enabling conditions and how they affect the applicability of hydrogen systems within their community. Then identifying the various hydrogen production pathways and use options that are most applicable to their community. And if there are options beyond that point, conducting a community-specific quantitative analysis with annual consumption data and load curves respective to their community. And lastly, these communities should reach out to the province or BC Hydro, if these are BC Hydro communities, for policy, financial, and or technical support, especially in accessing the required data and resources required to pursue hydrogen projects. So that's the end of the presentation, but I am happy to stay on and answer any further questions.
I had just a question, not to go into too much detail, but I'm curious about the LCOE of the diesel currently, and I've seen various studies about northern communities and very high LCOEs there. Like, what's the sort of typical diesel price that's assumed there, and is like diesel transportation costs, can those be significant as part of that today for these remote communities?
Yeah, Sandra, I know you have knowledge of the diesel price that we used for the studies. Diesel transportation costs for sure can be significant, as well as also one thing that we didn't factor into the study as well was refurbishment or replacement of diesel generating systems, which could also add significant costs to the case studies and increase the levelized cost of just the baseline diesel operating system. Presumably, the cost of transporting diesel to the communities is built into the costs that they're paying for diesel, that heavily subsidized cost. Unfortunately, also, this study is not reflective of the true cost of diesel, which would then factor in subsidies, which are extremely hard to track as they are coming from multiple sources.
Ali, are you able to see those typed questions?
Yes, I am. Just give me a second.
Okay.
So are you indicating that renewables plus hydrogen is less expensive per kilowatt hour as compared to renewables plus batteries? We didn't include the use of EV batteries within any of our case studies, just to clarify that as well. So for the first case study, achieving 80% emissions reductions, the levelized cost came out to about the same as renewables plus batteries versus renewables plus batteries plus hydrogen. However, again, to be clear, this includes the 40% subsidy from the Clean Hydrogen Investment Tax Credit. And so that's a major caveat as to whether that would apply in a practical situation. In the 100% emissions reduction scenario, the levelized cost did work out to being less than renewables plus batteries alone. And again, this is because really meeting that peak demand with what was the limited wind or solar resource within the community involved a significant overbuild of renewables, which was unsustainable. For example, that like doubling of wind and solar. And so again, it was showing that hydrogen plus renewables was less because the hydrogen was mitigating the need for that overbuild by meeting the peak demand. And again, that is also considering the 40% reduction with the investment tax credit.
Just to add to that, I think specifically in the 80% reduction scenario, we're still seeing that renewables plus stationary battery storage is the cheapest option. Where the things just start to get a little bit closer is like when we consider that added 10% essentially discount on hydrogen, it starts to become a little bit more competitive with batteries. Also, we did focus predominantly on 4-hour lithium batteries. So, in periods of sustained peak demand or periods where that 4-hour battery and the existing renewable generation was not capable of providing the peak demand of the communities, there would have to be significant oversizing of the battery systems or renewable generation, which again at that point hydrogen becomes a bit more of a competitive option, or the delta shrinks. So again, apples to apples, obviously renewables and storage remain a cheaper option on a levelized cost basis, but really it's when we get into the nuance of that additional government support for hydrogen coupled with the just prolonged periods of peak demand that just require overbuild of resources. But as Ali pointed out, we do think that the numbers are within the margins of error really for that level of analysis. So our conclusions really here rest on the assumptions that we made for our case study, and our recommendation would be that any community considers their specific nuance and circumstances in assessing the feasibility of such a project.
Thanks, Ahmed.
And just maybe to answer Michael's question, I did look back at our assumptions on diesel cost, and we're assuming an average of $1.6 per liter, escalating at inflation over the study period, which is, we don't have access to actual cost data from the community. So this was a reflection of a couple other sources that we were able to identify and some anecdotes that we've heard over, again, from other participants. So right, likely there's a bit of a variation around that number, with some communities having lower and some others having higher costs than that 1.6.
To answer Darren's question, is the LCOE for renewables assuming battery storage or purely wind and solar capacity implemented with the goal of 24-hour generation? No, so the LCOE for the renewables scenarios includes battery storage. Australia is using salt water to cultivate hydrogen, value adding by using crystallized salt as healthy mineral supplements. Wondering if this is being considered, given many of BC coast live on the ocean or coastal communities. Yeah, so we did not consider that or alternative forms of hydrogen. Was engagement with remote communities part of the study, and if so, what level of interest was there? For the second phase of our work, we did engage with a handful of remote communities. We got participation from 3 various remote communities. There was a general interest in hydrogen as part of the solution, or one of the solutions among other sources of energy, such as solar, wind, hydro, etc. And so a lot of these communities had goals to decarbonize and be more involved in their energy systems. And so there was a baseline level of interest from all of them. In terms of practical experience with hydrogen, none of these communities had any practical experience, but there was a solid level of interest. But I would caution and say that 3 communities out of the approximately 44, 45 communities that are remote communities that are in BC is certainly not indicative of the opinions and interests of all communities. Have you considered modeling for different base loads, tiny versus medium, large, and remote community? So because we only were doing 2 case studies, we just modeled it for the base load for each of those communities. The base load for those communities was very different. So the 100% diesel dependent community was fairly small, and I can't remember the exact number, but Shandana, you have
2 million, so 2,000 kilowatt hours for the remote community, and about 18 megawatt hours. So that's almost like 10 times of the remote
Yeah,
community.
for the end-of-line community. However, I know if your question is related to in the same context of 100% diesel community, what does it look like for a tiny versus a medium versus larger remote community? We did not do that within this case study. We just did one community for each, the 100% diesel and the end-of-line community. For Curran Crawford, for end-of-line communities case, did that include periods of line outages to the community? So we assume that every month the community would experience a full 5-day outage. We also assumed that at the end of those outages and between that outage and the next one, that there would be sufficient transmission capacity to replenish the hydrogen supply within the community. And so we did not take into consideration the availability of transmission capacity in between outage events and the implications of that. And someone asked, what potential do you see for combined decarbonization efforts between remote communities and remote industries like mining? There's certainly potential if a remote community is located near a remote mining operation. There are examples of remote mining or remote industrial operations using hydrogen systems. I believe there's one in remote Quebec. And so I think it would have to be a very community-specific consideration if that community was willing to work with the mining operation and what that agreement would look like between the two. But there is certainly an opportunity to explore achieving economies of scale for a very remote community that is nearby a remote industrial operation. Considering the role of achieving 100% decarbonization as highlighted in your study, how do you envision hydrogen integration in remote microgrid systems balancing the energy trilemma, security, equity, and sustainability? Specifically, could hydrogen complement renewable systems to mitigate overbuilds while addressing environmental and economic trade-offs? It absolutely could, potentially. Again, you would really need a community-specific case study. However, if hydrogen proves to be cost-effective and mitigates significant overbuild, thereby mitigating some extremely high expenditures, and it also allows the community to experience diesel reductions and thereby maybe being a more sustainable, as well as there's potential for communities to be more involved in their energy systems, making them more equitable and receiving some of the revenues from those energy systems. Hydrogen could present a viable option to the energy trilemma by addressing some of those like environmental and economic trade-offs. However, again, this is very community specific. Every remote community is so unique and has very unique circumstances and goals and priorities. And so their desire to participate and build a hydrogen system within their region is it's hard to generalize, but I do think there's a potential opportunity. Yes, that's what our results are saying. What are the energy losses from total energy in the work into work performed for hydrogen supplemental energy as compared to battery supplemental energy? Hydrogen is much less efficient.
I'm happy to take that one. So we don't have the loss numbers up like handy right now, but so what we did is we modeled this through a comprehensive techno-economic model that does consider the entire value chain of energy and energy balance from input to conversion losses to round trip efficiencies down to ultimate end use. So that the efficiency losses or the efficiency and respective losses of different technologies are factored in. But we don't have that number top of mind. But as you pointed out, the hydrogen process is probably on aggregate less efficient than round trip efficiency on batteries, which tend to be in the high 90s. But again, what we're seeing is that the the reduction in economics driven by government support, coupled with the prolonged outages, and really get the numbers to be shrink some of those deltas further. There's another caveat to the analysis here that I think we should also just be clear about. There has not to date been any hydrogen projects in remote communities in the region, so we're kind of flying blind on costs and things like that. We applied what we think are appropriate buffers to capture the fact that the cost structure of these products would be different than they would be in other parts of the country. But again, it remains uncertain what the actual both capex as well as operational costs of these products could be in a remote setting.
Thanks, Ahmed. And to Carrie's question, for the 100% emission reduction scenario with hydrogen, would any overbuild of renewables still be required for hydrogen production electrolysis? So hydrogen in these scenarios is only produced from excess renewable generation. And so, again, sort of as Ahmed was saying, the model takes into consideration the cost of all things. And so hydrogen is purely supported by excess generation from renewables. And so the model would then assess, is it more cost effective to overbuild more solar, to produce more solar, and then again, that excess would be used to produce hydrogen, or is it more cost effective to build batteries? But hydrogen production is only from excess renewable generation, and renewables would not be overbuilt necessarily just to accommodate hydrogen. It would be the most cost-effective combination of all three things, being renewables, storage, and battery storage and hydrogen. Doug, what happens to energy costs after hydrogen subsidies are removed? So the hydrogen subsidies are applied to the hydrogen technologies for the capital costs. And then they're not applied in terms of if the equipment need to be replaced later down the road outside of the 10-year span for the clean hydrogen tax credit. But we have assumed that the cost of hydrogen technologies will decrease significantly by the point of being replaced outside as they mature. So the tax credit is not applied. However, we assume that hydrogen, the technology costs will have matured and decreased over time.
I had one more question about equipment costs. How much do the equipment costs reduce for hydrogen and for batteries in your projections?
I don't have the exact cost up with me. I'm sorry, excuse me. That would involve opening the model, but it was significant, the reductions in costs. Or Sanjana, do you have them?
Yeah, no, I think we assume that the reductions would be similar to if we had taken off the ITC at the end of the lifespan of each of the fuel cell or electrolyzer. That's as much the cost would have reduced by then to have offset that 40% or so in the 15 years or 25 plus years.
And so just to clarify that, I think that there's two different sets of costs that we're talking about. There's the equipment cost and there's the hydrogen cost, as a fuel over the study period. So in terms of equipment cost, what we've modeled is a snapshot in time. We haven't modeled, different years at which the deployment would happen. So the cost projections that we have for cost of batteries, cost of electrolyzers, and so on would be I can't remember this exact study period point that we've had, but that would be a unit in time that would reflect the latest and greatest projections of technology costs. With respect to the hydrogen projections that Sanjana and Eleni were pointing to, that's more as for the options where there is hydrogen fuel being imported for end-of-line communities. We have to make projections on the long-term trajectory of hydrogen cost over the lifetime of the asset, 25, 30 years. And that's where we'd have to make assumptions on at what point would cost the benefits from federal incentive tax credits fade away and no longer be factored into the fuel of hydrogen being imported into the end of line communities. But for overall, so I guess that also answers your first question up there, Doug, about what happens to the energy cost after hydrogen subsidies are removed. We didn't model a scenario where there is no hydrogen subsidies. So we modeled a snapshot based on today's construct. If we had modeled that scenario, I can't speak the exact numbers, but that delta would increase significantly. So that 40% ITC is definitely covering a fairly big portion of the upfront cost of projects. Ali and Sanjana's point was really specific on the import cost of fuels that we would be bringing into end of line communities. And Ali and Sanjana, please correct me if I misrepresented that.
To be clear, the lifespan, I believe it's the electrolyzer, Sanjana, was like it would be replaced within the lifetime of the project.
Yeah.
So we did assume that the electrolyzer being replaced 15 years into the project would have a reduced cost, and that reduced cost was equivalent to about a 40%, like the same as the ITC. So in 15 years from now, the base cost of the electrolyzer technology, when it would be replaced, would be 40% less than the current price, so equal to the current price because the current price is being discounted by 40% for the ITC. But yes, we did not. But yes, everything else you said is correct, and that we did not model additional scenarios.
We don't have any other questions in the queue, and I don't see any more hands raised. Have a good afternoon and a good weekend upcoming. Take care, everyone.